The stagecoach driver's warning still echoed in Eleanor Price's ears as she stepped onto the dusty main street of Redemption Ridge. Caleb Mercer? Ma'am, that man's killed more times than he's smiled. You sure you want to go through with this? She clutched her mother's journal tighter, her only possession besides the worn contract that bound her to a stranger. It was 1867. She was 23 years old, broke and alone. 3,000 miles from everything she'd ever known. Marry a dangerous man or starve. Those were her choices. Behind her, the stage pulled away, cutting off her last chance to run. Before we begin Eleanor's journey into the unknown, if you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's step back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, Eleanor Price had stood in the cramped Boston boarding house room that had been her prison for the past year, holding a newspaper advertisement that promised salvation or damnation. She wasn't sure which. Wanted. Respectable woman for marriage. Western rancher seeks companion of good character. Must be willing to work hard and adapt to frontier life. Room, board, and protection guaranteed. Respond to C. Mercer, Redemption Ridge, Colorado Territory. The paper trembled in her hands, though whether from fear or hope she couldn't say. Around her the walls seemed to close in, wallpaper peeling like dead skin, the smell of mildew and desperation thick enough to choke on. This room, barely larger than a closet, had cost her every penny she'd earned working 16-hour days at the textile mill since her mother's death. Margaret Price had died 6 months ago, slowly, painfully, while Eleanor watched helplessly. The medicines cost money they didn't have. The doctor's visits drained what little remained. In the end, her mother had pressed a leather-bound journal into Eleanor's hands, the only thing of value she'd owned, and whispered, "Don't let this city swallow you whole like it did me. Promise me. Find somewhere you can breathe." Eleanor had promised, though she'd had no idea how to keep that promise until now. She read the advertisement again, studying each word like a contract with the devil himself. Protection guaranteed. From what? The question gnawed at her, but desperation made her pen move across paper anyway. Her response had been careful, measured, revealing just enough truth to seem honest without exposing her complete destitution. She mentioned her mother's recent passing, her ability to read and write, her skills with a needle and in a kitchen. She didn't mention the gnawing hunger, the landlady's threats of eviction, or the foreman at the mill whose hands had started lingering too long on her waist. Caleb Mercer's reply arrived 3 weeks later, brief and businesslike. He would pay for her passage west. The marriage would be one of practical partnership rather than romantic love, though he hoped mutual respect might develop. He owned a cattle ranch, lived simply, and expected a woman who could handle the isolation and demands of frontier life. If she agreed to these terms, she should arrive by September. He enclosed money for the journey, more than Eleanor had seen in months. She'd accepted immediately, before fear could override survival instinct. The journey west had been an education in exactly how vast and unforgiving America could be. Eleanor had traveled by train through landscapes that made her feel impossibly small. Endless plains that seemed to swallow the sky, mountains that tore at the clouds, rivers wider than any street she'd known in Boston. Then the trains had ended, and the real frontier began. The stagecoach to Redemption Ridge carried 6 passengers, each with their own story of desperation or ambition that had driven them west. Eleanor sat wedged between a whiskey drummer and a stern-faced woman traveling to meet her sister. Across from her, 2 prospectors argued about the best routes to the mining camps, while a pale young man who'd introduced himself as a clerk coughed wetly into a handkerchief. The driver, a grizzled man named Hoskins, who looked like he'd been carved from the same rock as the mountains, had studied Eleanor with knowing eyes when she'd boarded. "Where you headed, miss?" he'd asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Redemption Ridge. I'm to be married there." "Married, huh?" He'd spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Who's the unlucky fellow?" "Caleb Mercer." The change in the coach had been immediate and profound. The whiskey drummer had shifted away from her. The prospector's argument had died mid-sentence. Even the sick clerk had looked up, something like pity crossing his features. Hoskins had studied her for a long moment. "You know anything about Mercer, miss?" "I know he's a rancher. I know he needs a wife." "He needs a wife like a wolf needs sheep's clothing. the stern woman had muttered. Hoskins had silenced her with a look before turning back to Eleanor. Ma'am, I feel obliged to tell you, Caleb Mercer's got a reputation in these parts. He's not a sociable man. There's talk. What kind of talk? The driver had exchanged glances with the other passengers, some unspoken communication passing between them. The killing kind. Eleanor's blood had gone cold, but she'd forced her voice to remain steady. The war ended 2 years ago. Lots of men killed during the war. Yes, ma'am, they did. But the war's over, and Mercer, well, let's just say trouble follows him like flies follow a carcass. Last year, 3 men tried to jump his claim. He buried all 3. The year before that, he shot a card cheat in the Redemption Saloon. Man was cheating, sure enough, but Mercer didn't give him a chance to reach for his gun. Just put a bullet through his hand and another through his knee. Told him to crawl back to whatever hole he'd crawled out of. If the man was cheating, I'm not saying Mercer was wrong, miss. I'm saying he's dangerous. There's a difference between a man who'll fight when pressed and a man who's got violence living in his bones. Caleb Mercer's the second kind. The stern woman had leaned forward then, her voice dropping to something almost kind. Child, it's not too late. You can stay in town when we arrive. There are other options. Mrs. Henderson runs a boarding house. She's always looking for help. It wouldn't be easy, but it'd be safer than marrying a man like that. Eleanor had wanted to ask what those other options would pay, whether they'd be enough to keep her fed and housed, whether Mrs. Henderson's boarding house would be any different from the one she'd fled in Boston, but she'd already known the answer. I appreciate your concern, she'd said quietly, but I've made my commitment. The journey had continued in uncomfortable silence after that, broken only by the rattle of wheels and the occasional cough from the clerk. Eleanor had watched the landscape grow rougher, more severe, fewer trees, more rock and scrub, the sky so vast it seemed to press down like a weight. She'd pulled out her mother's journal, running her fingers over the worn leather. Inside, her mother's handwriting chronicled 20 years of life in Boston. The hopes she'd had when she'd arrived from Ireland, the slow erosion of those hopes, the quiet desperation of survival in a city that ground people down to nothing. On one of the last pages, her mother had written, Eleanor is braver than she knows. I see her father's strength in her, that stubborn refusal to surrender even when surrendering would be easier. I pray she uses that strength to find a better life than I did. I pray she doesn't let fear make her choices. Eleanor had closed the journal, blinking back tears. Fear was making her choices now. Fear of starvation, of ending up like her mother, of the mill foreman's wandering hands. But maybe fear was just another kind of strength, the will to survive by any means necessary. The stagecoach had stopped for the night at a way station, little more than a crude building surrounded by a corral and a few scraggly trees. The passengers had eaten a meal of salt pork and beans, while the station keeper, a toothless old man, had regaled them with stories of Indian raids and bandit attacks. You're lucky you got Hoskins driving, he'd said, gesturing with a fork. He knows this country, knows which routes are safe and which ones will get you scalped or robbed. The whiskey drummer had used the opportunity to sell some of his wares to the station keeper, his pitch smooth and practiced. Eleanor had watched him work, marveling at how easily some people moved through the world, always finding an angle, always landing on their feet. That night, sleeping on a hard wooden bunk in a room she shared with the stern woman, Eleanor had dreamed of her mother. In the dream, Margaret Price had been young and healthy, the way she must have looked when she'd first arrived in Boston full of hope. She'd smiled at Eleanor and said, Sometimes the only way forward is through fear, not around it. Eleanor had woken before dawn, those words still echoing in her mind. The final day of travel had been the longest. The coach climbed into rougher country, following a road that was barely more than ruts carved into rock. Twice they'd had to stop while Hoskins and the prospectors cleared fallen rocks from the path. The air grew thinner, colder, carrying the scent of pine and something wild that Eleanor couldn't name. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Redemption Ridge finally appeared, a collection of wooden buildings huddled in a valley like survivors of a shipwreck. From a distance, it looked both more and less than Eleanor had imagined. More real, certainly. She could see smoke rising from chimneys, horses tied to hitching posts, the shapes of people moving through the streets. but less substantial too, as though a strong wind might scatter it all like leaves. "Welcome to the end of the earth," Hoskins had announced as the coach began its descent. "Such as it is." The stern woman had touched Eleanor's hand. "It's not too late," she'd said one final time. But it was. Eleanor knew that as surely as she knew her own name. The moment she'd spent Caleb Mercer's money to travel west, she'd committed herself. To turn back now would be both impossible and unthinkable. The coach had rattled into town just as the sun touched the mountain peaks, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Eleanor had her first real look at the place that was to be her home. A main street of packed dirt, buildings that looked like they'd been thrown together in a hurry and might fall apart just as quickly. Men in dusty clothes and women in faded dresses. It looked nothing like Boston. It looked exactly like the fresh start she'd been desperate for. The coach had lurched to a stop in front of a building with a hand-painted sign reading General Store and Post Office. Hoskins had climbed down and opened the door, offering Eleanor his hand. "You sure about this, miss?" he'd asked one final time. Eleanor had taken a deep breath, tasting dust and pine and possibility. "I'm sure." She'd stepped down onto the street, her legs shaky from days of travel, her dress rumpled and stained with road dust. Around her, the other passengers had disembarked, claiming their luggage and heading off to their various destinations. The stern woman had given Eleanor one last pitying look before hurrying away. Eleanor had stood alone on the street, clutching her single small trunk and her mother's journal, scanning the faces of the men gathered near the coach. Which one was Caleb Mercer? The tall man with the sheriff's star, the older gentleman in the suit examining the new arrivals, the young cowboy leaning against a post, watching her with open curiosity? None of them moved toward her. Hoskins had retrieved her trunk, setting it beside her with a grunt. "You want? I can ask around, find out where Mercer might be." "Thank you, but I can—" "Eleanor Price?" The voice had come from behind her, low and rough like wind over stone. Eleanor had turned, and her breath had caught in her throat. The man standing 10 feet away was nothing like what she'd imagined. Tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block the fading sunlight. He wore dark pants, a shirt that might have been blue once but had faded to something closer to gray, and a leather vest that had seen hard use. A gun belt sat low on his hips, the holster worn smooth in a way that spoke of frequent use. But it was his face that held her attention. Weathered, hard, with a jaw that looked carved from granite, and eyes that were an unsettling shade of pale blue. Like ice, Eleanor thought, or a winter sky just before a storm. A scar ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, thin and white against his sun-darkened skin. His hair was dark brown, touched with gray at the temples, despite him looking only in his mid-30s. This was a man who'd seen violence and dealt it out in return. This was the kind of man mothers warned their daughters about. This was Caleb Mercer. "I'm Eleanor Price," she'd managed, proud that her voice barely trembled. He'd studied her for a long moment, those cold eyes taking in every detail. Her worn dress, her nervous hands clutching the journal, the fear she was trying so hard to hide. When he finally spoke again, his voice was flat, almost emotionless. "The stage is running late. I expected you an hour ago." Not welcome or "I'm pleased to meet you," or even a simple greeting, just a statement of fact, delivered without warmth. "The road was rough," Eleanor had said. "We had to stop to clear rocks." He'd nodded once, a sharp, economical movement. "We should go. It's an hour's ride to the ranch, and I don't like traveling these roads after dark." He'd reached for her trunk, lifting it with an ease that suggested it weighed nothing, and carried it to a wagon waiting nearby. The horses hitched to it were large, sturdy animals that watched Eleanor with the same wary assessment as their owner. Eleanor had hesitated, her feet refusing to move. This was it, the moment of choice. She could still refuse, could still turn to Hoskins and beg for help finding that boarding house the woman had mentioned. She could still run. But run where? Back to Boston and the mill and the landlady's threats? Back to the foreman's wandering hands and the slow starvation of city poverty? No. Forward was the only direction left. She'd walked to the wagon, and Caleb Mercer had offered his hand to help her up. His grip was strong, calloused, impersonal. He might as well have been helping a stranger onto a train. Once she was seated, he'd climbed up beside her, taken the reins, and clicked his tongue at the horses. They'd pulled out of town without another word. The ride to the ranch had been conducted in nearly complete silence. Caleb had focused on the road, little more than a track through increasingly wild country, while Eleanor had tried not to stare at the man who was to be her husband. Husband. The word felt foreign in her mind, connected to a stranger who sat beside her, radiating the kind of self-contained isolation usually found in wild animals. He hadn't looked at her once since they'd left town, hadn't attempted conversation, hadn't done anything to ease the tension that sat between them like a living thing. Finally, desperate to fill the silence with something, Eleanor had spoken. The town seems prosperous. It's getting there. Gold rush brought people. Cattle industry keeps them. How long have you been here? 7 years. And your ranch will be there soon. The words were clipped, final, closing off further questions. Eleanor had lapsed back into silence, watching the landscape grow wilder as they climbed into hill country. The sun disappeared behind the mountains, and shadows stretched long across the trail. The temperature dropped sharply, and Eleanor had pulled her thin shawl tighter, shivering. Without a word, Caleb had reached behind the seat and produced a heavy blanket, handing it to her. The gesture might have been kind if it hadn't felt so perfunctory, like tending to livestock. "Thank you," Eleanor had murmured. He'd nodded once and returned his attention to the road. As darkness gathered, Eleanor had found herself studying him in sidelong glances, trying to reconcile the man beside her with the warnings she'd received. He was certainly intimidating, that much was clear. Everything about him spoke of a man who'd learned to survive in hard country, who'd shed anything soft or unnecessary until only the essential remained. But dangerous? Violent? She'd wanted to ask him directly, to demand the truth about the stories she'd heard. But the words had stuck in her throat, because part of her was terrified of what he might say. Better to live in uncertain fear than confirmed terror. The ranch, when it finally appeared, had been both a relief and a new source of anxiety. Set in a small valley surrounded by pine-covered hills, it consisted of a main house, a barn, a corral, and several outbuildings. Even in the gathering darkness, Eleanor could see it was a working ranch, practical and well-maintained. Lights glowed in the windows of the main house, warm and welcoming. Caleb had pulled the wagon up to the house and climbed down, then reached up to help Eleanor. His hands had circled her waist, lifting her down easily, and for a moment they'd stood close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, could smell leather and sage, and something else distinctly masculine. Then he'd stepped back, the moment broken. "I'll show you inside," he'd said. "We can talk about the arrangement." The arrangement. Not their marriage, not their future together. The arrangement. Like a business contract, which Eleanor supposed it was. She'd followed him into the house, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. The interior was Spartan, but clean. A main room with a stone fireplace, a table, a few chairs. Doors led off to what Eleanor assumed were bedrooms and a kitchen. Everything was functional, built for use rather than beauty. No curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no decoration of any kind. It looked exactly like the home of a man who lived alone and intended to keep it that way. Caleb had gestured to a chair. "Sit. I'll make coffee." He disappeared into the kitchen while Eleanor had perched on the edge of the chair, looking around this place that was supposed to become her home. On the mantel above the fireplace, she'd noticed a single photograph, a woman and a young boy, both smiling. She'd wanted to ask about it, but had bitten back the question. Caleb had returned with 2 tin cups of coffee, strong and black. He'd handed her one and taken a seat across the table, putting distance between them. "We should discuss expectations," he'd said without preamble. "This is a working ranch. I run cattle, grow what crops this land will support, and do contract work for the army when needed. It's not easy living, and I can't promise it'll get easier." "I understand." "I don't think you do, but you will soon enough." He'd taken a sip of coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. "I need someone who can manage a household, who can handle herself when I'm away, who won't fall apart when things get hard. Can you do that?" Eleanor had lifted her chin. "I managed a household in Boston after my mother became ill. I worked in a textile mill 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. I traveled 3,000 miles alone to get here. I don't fall apart easily, Mr. Mercer." Something that might have been approval had flickered in his eyes. Good. You'll need that stubbornness out here. The advertisement said room, board, and protection. I'd like to understand what that means. It means you'll have a place to sleep, food to eat, and my name to shield you from men who might think a woman alone is fair game. This is rough country, Miss Price. A woman without a man's protection is vulnerable in ways you can't imagine. And what do you expect in return? The question had hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to voice directly. Caleb had set down his coffee cup carefully. I expect you to manage this household, to handle things when I'm not here, to not ask questions about my past or my business. What I don't expect, he'd paused, choosing words carefully, is a conventional marriage. You'll have your own room, your privacy will be respected. This is a partnership of necessity, not anything else. Eleanor had felt something loosen in her chest, relief mixed with an emotion she couldn't quite name. I see. There's one more thing you need to understand. His voice had hardened, and those ice-blue eyes had fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away. You've probably heard stories about me. Some of them are true. I've killed men, Miss Price. I won't apologize for that or explain it. I protect what's mine, and I don't hesitate when threatened. If that frightens you, you should say so now. This was the moment. Eleanor had known she should be terrified, should demand he take her back to town immediately. But she'd looked at this hard, dangerous man and remembered her mother's words. Sometimes the only way forward is through fear, not around it. Does that mean you'll protect me? She'd asked quietly. He'd blinked, clearly not expecting that question. Yes? From anyone who would threaten me or harm me? Yes. Then I'm not frightened, Mr. Mercer. I'm grateful. They'd stared at each other across the table, and Eleanor had seen something shift in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or reassessment. We should formalize this, he'd said finally, standing. He'd gone to a drawer and pulled out papers. A marriage license that needed signing, a contract he'd drawn up outlining their arrangement in stark legal terms. Eleanor had read it carefully. Everything he'd promised was there: room, board, protection, a stipend of her own to use as she wished. In return, she would manage his household and represent herself as his wife. The document made no mention of marital duties or expectations beyond the practical. She'd signed her name, each letter feeling like sealing her fate. Caleb had signed as well, then produced 2 more documents. These need to go to the territorial registry. Once they're filed, the marriage will be legal. When will that happen? I'll ride to town tomorrow. We'll be officially married by week's end. Such a strange, cold way to speak of marriage. But then, this was a strange, cold arrangement. Caleb had shown her to a small bedroom, clean, furnished with a bed, dresser, and washstand, but as impersonal as everything else in the house. This is yours, he'd said. I'm across the hall if you need anything. Then he'd left her alone. Eleanor had sat on the edge of the bed, looking around this room that was now hers, in a house that was now her home, bound to a man who was now her husband in everything but the most intimate sense. She should have felt relief. Instead, she'd felt only a strange numbness, as though she'd traded one prison for another, a larger one, certainly, with better bars, but a prison nonetheless. From her trunk, she'd pulled out her mother's journal, opening it to that final entry. Eleanor is braver than she knows. Was this bravery? Or just another form of surrender? She hadn't known then. Sitting in that small bedroom on her first night in Caleb Mercer's house, listening to him move around in the room across the hall, Eleanor had wondered if she'd ever know. Had she chosen survival, or had survival chosen her? Was there even a difference? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the house creak. It was a lonely sound, vast and empty, exactly like the landscape that surrounded this small outpost of human habitation. Eleanor had lain down fully clothed, too exhausted and overwhelmed to change into her nightdress, and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. Footsteps moved past her room, then faded. She'd thought she wouldn't sleep, but exhaustion finally claimed her. Her last waking thought was of her mother, wondering if Margaret Price would have approved of this choice or wept for it. The answer, Eleanor suspected, was both. Eleanor woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood. each strike sharp and rhythmic in the pre-dawn stillness. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day crashed over her like cold water. The ranch, Caleb Mercer, the contract she'd signed that bound her to this place, and this stranger. She rose stiffly, her muscles aching from days of travel and a night spent sleeping in her clothes. Through the small window, she could see the first gray light of dawn touching the mountains, painting them in shades of silver and shadow. The chopping continued, steady and relentless. The washstand held a pitcher of clean water. Caleb must have filled it while she slept. Eleanor washed quickly, the cold water shocking her fully awake, then changed into her only other dress, a simple gray cotton that had seen better days. She braided her dark hair, pinned it up, and studied herself in the small mirror above the dresser. She looked pale, frightened, young, 23 years old and already feeling ancient, worn down by loss and desperation. Her mother's green eyes stared back at her from her own face, and Eleanor wondered again if Margaret Price would have approved of this choice. The house was quiet when she emerged from her room. Through the front window she could see Caleb in the yard, splitting logs with methodical precision. He'd removed his shirt despite the morning chill, and Eleanor found herself transfixed by the play of muscles across his back and shoulders, the way his body moved with the kind of efficient grace that came from years of hard labor. Scars crisscrossed his skin, some thin and white, others darker, puckered, telling stories of violence survived. He was, she realized with a start, a beautiful man in the way wild things were beautiful, dangerous and compelling and utterly untamed. As though sensing her gaze, Caleb turned. Their eyes met through the window, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at being caught watching him. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, then drove the axe into the chopping block and reached for his shirt. By the time he entered the house, Eleanor had retreated to the kitchen, desperate for something to occupy her hands and mind. The room was as Spartan as the rest of the house, a wood stove, a few shelves holding basic supplies, a table scarred from use. She found coffee and set about making a pot, grateful for the familiar task. Caleb appeared in the doorway, now fully dressed, his hair damp as though he'd dunked his head in the water trough. "You didn't need to do that." "I don't mind. I'm accustomed to rising early." Eleanor kept her voice steady, professional, as though this were a normal household arrangement and not the strangest situation she'd ever found herself in. He crossed to a cabinet and pulled out a frying pan. "Can you cook?" "Yes. Nothing fancy, but I can manage basic meals." "Good. I can cook enough to keep from starving, but I won't pretend to have any skill at it." He set the pan on the stove, then retrieved eggs and bacon from the cold box. "I'll show you where everything is, how things work around here. Then I need to ride out to check the herd." They worked in awkward silence, preparing breakfast together in the small kitchen. Eleanor found herself hyper-aware of his presence, the way he moved, the rough texture of his voice when he spoke, the careful distance he maintained between them. He was trying, she realized, to put her at ease, though his methods were as rough and unpracticed as everything else about him. When they sat down to eat, Caleb outlined her days with the same methodical precision he'd applied to splitting wood. The chickens needed tending, the garden required watering, the house needed managing. There was a root cellar stocked with supplies, a smokehouse for preserving meat, a spring house that kept things cool. He would handle the heavy labor, the cattle, the horses, repairs and maintenance, but the domestic sphere would be her domain. "I'm usually gone from dawn until dusk," he said, sopping up egg yolk with a piece of bread. "Sometimes longer if I'm working the far pastures or dealing with the cattle. You'll be alone most days." "I'm not afraid of solitude, Mr. Mercer." "Caleb." The correction was quiet but firm. "If we're going to live as husband and wife, even in name only, we should use given names." "Caleb, then." The name felt strange on her tongue, too intimate for someone who was still essentially a stranger. "And you should call me Eleanor." He nodded, a flash of something, approval perhaps, crossing his face. "There's a rifle above the mantel. Do you know how to shoot?" The question caught her off guard. "No." "I'll teach you. Out here, everyone needs to know how to defend themselves." He stood, gathering the plates. "Bears sometimes come down from the mountains. Wolves, too, though they usually avoid humans, and there are men who are more dangerous than any animal." There it was again, that hint of violence, the suggestion that danger was never far away. Eleanor wanted to ask what kind of men he meant, whether they were a real threat or just a possibility he guarded against. But the question died in her throat because part of her didn't want to know, didn't want to confront the reality of just how isolated and vulnerable she was out here. Caleb must have seen something in her expression because his voice softened slightly. I don't mean to frighten you, but you need to understand what life here entails. This isn't Boston. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. The town is an hour's ride. If something happens, you'll need to rely on yourself first. I understand. Do you? He studied her with those unsettling pale eyes. You're a long way from everything you've known, Eleanor. This land doesn't forgive mistakes or weakness. I need to know you can handle that. Eleanor met his gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of strength she wasn't sure she possessed. I watched my mother die by inches because we couldn't afford medicine. I worked in a mill where women lost fingers in the machinery and were fired for bleeding on the fabric. I traveled across a continent alone with nothing but hope and desperation. I can handle whatever this land requires, Caleb. I don't have any other choice. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in that impassive facade, a glimpse of the man beneath the armor. No, he said quietly. I don't suppose you do. He showed her around the property after breakfast, walking her through the practical realities of ranch life. The chickens were easy enough. Collect eggs, scatter feed, keep the coop clean. The garden was more challenging, struggling in the harsh mountain soil, requiring constant attention to coax anything edible from the earth. The barn housed 2 horses, a massive bay gelding named Ranger that Caleb rode, and a smaller mare named Sable that he said Eleanor could learn to handle if she wished. She's gentle, Caleb said, running a hand down the mare's neck. Good-natured. She won't give you trouble. Eleanor approached cautiously, extending her hand for the horse to sniff. Sable's breath was warm against her palm, her large eyes curious but calm. I've never ridden. I'll teach you that too. It's necessary out here. You need to be able to get to town if there's an emergency, and I'm not available. The thought of emergencies, of being alone and in danger with only her own wits to rely on, sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. But she nodded, adding it to the growing list of skills she would need to acquire to survive in this new life. They walked the property boundaries, Caleb pointing out landmarks and explaining the lay of the land. His ranch encompassed several hundred acres of valley and hill country, he told her, with good water and grazing for his cattle. He ran about 200 head, selling to the army and to the mining camps, supplementing that income with occasional work as a tracker or guide. You track for the army? Eleanor asked. Sometimes, when they need someone who knows the country. His voice was carefully neutral, but Eleanor sensed there was more to it than that. Is that dangerous work? All work out here has an element of danger. He glanced at her, those ice blue eyes unreadable. You're thinking about what the stage driver told you, about my reputation. It wasn't a question, and Eleanor saw no point in denying it. People seemed concerned when I mentioned your name. Caleb stopped walking, turning to face her fully. Around them, the morning was crisp and clear, the mountains standing sentinel against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. I told you last night, some of those stories are true. I've killed men. I won't apologize for it or dress it up pretty for your comfort. I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm trying to understand what kind of man I've bound myself to. A careful one. A prepared one. His jaw tightened. During the war, I learned that hesitation gets you killed, that mercy is a luxury you can't afford when survival is at stake. I came out here to leave that behind, to build something instead of just destroying. But the lesson stayed with me. I protect what's mine, Eleanor. Always. And I don't give second chances to people who prove themselves threats. Eleanor absorbed this, trying to reconcile the controlled, methodical man before her with the violence he described so matter-of-factly. The men you killed, were they threatening you? Every one of them. Reed Callahan and his brothers tried to run me off my land, said I had no right to claim it. I gave them chances to walk away. They didn't take them. His voice was flat, emotionless, recounting facts rather than defending actions. The card cheat in town pulled a derringer on me when I called him out. I was faster. And the 3 who jumped my claim last year came armed in the night, planning to kill me in my sleep. I heard them coming. And the sheriff knows I acted in self-defense every time. I don't seek out violence, Eleanor, but I don't run from it either." They stood in silence, the weight of his words settling between them. Eleanor tried to imagine what it must be like to live with such constant vigilance, to see threats in every shadow, to know that survival depended on being faster, harder, more willing to do violence than your enemies. "You said you protect what's yours," she said finally. "Does that include me now?" Caleb's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Yes. From the moment you signed that contract, you became my responsibility. Anyone who tries to harm you will answer to me." There was a promise in those words, dark and absolute. Eleanor should have been frightened by it, by the casual certainty with which he spoke of violence. Instead, she felt something unexpected, safety perhaps, or the beginning of it. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone was standing between her and the world's dangers. "I should get to work," Caleb said, breaking the moment. "There's meat in the smokehouse, vegetables in the root cellar. Fix whatever you like for supper. I'll be back before dark." He retrieved Ranger from the barn, swinging into the saddle with practiced ease, and rode out without looking back. Eleanor watched him go, the stranger who was now her husband, and wondered if she would ever truly understand him. The days developed a rhythm quickly. Eleanor rose with the sun, tended to her domestic tasks, and tried not to count the hours until Caleb returned. He was gone most of each day, returning tired and dusty as evening fell. They ate together in near silence, exchanged basic information about their respective days, then retreated to their separate rooms. It was, Eleanor thought, like living with a ghost, sharing space with someone who was present but not truly there, whose life brushed against hers without ever truly connecting. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. It started small. The third morning, Eleanor found fresh milk waiting in the spring house. Caleb had milked the cow before dawn. The fourth day, he returned from town with fabric and thread, setting them on the table without explanation. When Eleanor looked at him questioningly, he'd simply said, "Your dresses are worn. You should have proper clothes." A week into her residence, she woke to find he'd repaired the loose board on the porch that she'd mentioned in passing. 2 days after that, a small bookshelf appeared in the main room, stocked with volumes he must have purchased or traded for in town. Novels, poetry, history. "I noticed you reading your mother's journal," he'd said when she'd thanked him. "Thought you might like something new." Eleanor had been so moved she'd barely managed a coherent response. In Boston, books had been a luxury she couldn't afford. Here, in this rough frontier house, Caleb Mercer had provided them without being asked, recognizing a need she hadn't voiced. She began to notice other things about him, too. The way he was unfailingly gentle with the animals, patient with the horses, and calm with the cattle in a way that contrasted sharply with his treatment of humans. The meticulous care he took with his tools and equipment, cleaning and maintaining everything with the same methodical precision he applied to all his work. The fact that he never raised his voice, never showed anger or frustration even when things went wrong. He was a man of rigid self-control, Eleanor realized. Whatever violence lived in him, he kept it leashed with iron discipline. She learned his routines, his habits. He rose before dawn and split wood while the world was still dark, a ritual that seemed to serve as meditation as much as practical purpose. He checked the perimeter of the property every morning, looking for signs of predators or intruders. He spent hours in the barn working with his tools, making repairs, preparing for seasons to come. And every evening, before retiring, he checked and cleaned his weapons, rifle, shotgun, pistol, with the same careful attention a priest might give to sacred objects. Eleanor asked him about it one night 2 weeks into her residence. "Why do you check them every day? Surely once a week would be sufficient." Caleb had looked up from where he was oiling the rifle's mechanism. "During the war, I saw men die because their weapons misfired at critical moments. Dirty barrel, damaged firing pin, things that could have been prevented with proper maintenance. I made a promise then, my weapons would never fail when I needed them. Do you expect to need them?" "I hope not. But hope isn't a survival strategy." He'd set down the rifle and picked up his pistol, checking the cylinder with practiced efficiency. Out here, being prepared is the difference between living and dying. I intend to keep living. Is that why you want to teach me to shoot? Partly. Also because you should be able to protect yourself if I'm not here. The world isn't kind to helpless women, Eleanor. She'd bristled at that. I'm not helpless. No, he'd agreed, surprising her. You're not. But you're untrained, which is almost as dangerous. Strength without skill is just liability. The shooting lessons began the following day. Caleb set up targets in a clearing beyond the barn and showed Eleanor how to hold the rifle, how to sight along the barrel, how to account for wind and distance. His teaching style was patient but exacting. He corrected her stance, her grip, her breathing with quiet precision until she could group shots tolerably well. You're a natural, he'd said after her first week of practice. Good eye, steady hands. Keep practicing and you'll be better than competent. The praise, sparse as it was, had warmed Eleanor more than she wanted to admit. In Caleb's world of careful economy, such words carried weight. She began cooking more elaborate meals, using the supplies in the root cellar to create dishes that went beyond mere sustenance. Caleb never commented directly, but she noticed he ate everything she prepared, and sometimes she caught something that might have been appreciation crossing his face. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, Eleanor made an apple pie using fruit from the gnarled trees behind the house. When she set it on the table, Caleb stared at it for a long moment. Something wrong? Eleanor asked. No, I haven't had pie in 7 years. His voice was rough, and when he looked up at her, something in his expression made Eleanor's breath catch. My mother used to make apple pie before the war. It was the first time he'd mentioned family, the first crack in his armor of self-sufficiency. Eleanor sat down across from him, suddenly desperate to know more about this man who guarded his past so carefully. Where's your mother now? Dead. My father, too. They had a farm in Missouri. Burned during the war, whether by Union soldiers or Confederate raiders, I never found out. They died in the fire. He cut into the pie, his movements precise despite the emotion Eleanor could hear beneath his words. I was away fighting, came home to ashes. I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago. I learned to carry it. He took a bite of pie, and Eleanor saw his throat work as he swallowed. This is good. Better than I remember. They ate in silence, but it felt different now. Less isolating, more companionable. Eleanor ventured another question, emboldened by this glimpse of the man beneath the armor. The photograph on the mantel, is that your family? Caleb's fork stilled. For a moment, Eleanor thought she'd overstepped, that he would shut down again. But then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. My sister, Mary, and her son, Daniel. They lived in Kansas. Cholera took them both 4 years ago. The grief in those simple words was staggering. Eleanor thought of her own mother, of the pain of that loss, and recognized it reflected in Caleb's carefully controlled expression. Everyone I've loved is dead, he continued, setting down his fork. Parents, sister, nephew, friends from the war. That's why I live the way I do, Eleanor. Not because I'm cold or unfeeling, but because caring hurts too much when everything gets taken away. Eleanor's heart ached for him, for the losses he'd endured, for the walls he'd built to protect himself from further pain. Is that why you wanted a practical marriage? To avoid caring? Partly. He met her eyes and she saw raw honesty there. I thought I could have companionship without risking attachment. Someone to share the work and the silence, but nothing deeper. Nothing that could hurt when it was inevitably lost. Life doesn't work that way, though, does it? A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. No, I'm beginning to realize it doesn't. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of shared vulnerability. They were both survivors, both carrying losses that had shaped them into careful, guarded people, both trying to build something new from the ruins of what they'd lost. The conversation moved to safer topics after that, but the intimacy of those shared confidences lingered. When Eleanor retired that night, she found herself thinking not of the dangerous man she'd been warned about, but of the grieving, lonely person beneath that hard exterior. The following week, a rancher named Thomas Garrett rode up to the house while Caleb was out with the herd. Eleanor was in the garden, and she heard the horse before she saw it, heavy hoofbeats approaching fast. Garrett was a large man, florid-faced and loud, with eyes that took in Eleanor's figure with an appreciation that made her skin crawl. "Well now," he said, not bothering to dismount. "You must be Mercer's mail-order bride. Heard he'd sent for one." Eleanor straightened, wiping dirt from her hands. "I'm Mrs. Mercer. Can I help you?" "Mrs. Mercer," he repeated, grinning. "Fancy title for someone purchased like cattle. Where's your husband?" "Out with the herd. He should return this evening." "Shame. I wanted to discuss selling me some of his stock." Garrett's eyes raked over her again. "Though the view here ain't bad. Tell me, darling, how much did you cost him? I might be in the market for a woman myself." Rage flared hot in Eleanor's chest. "I'm not for sale, Mr. Garrett, and if you have business with my husband, you can wait in town for him or come back another time. You're not welcome here." Garrett's expression darkened. "Mighty high-toned for a whore with a marriage license. Maybe I should teach you some manners." The distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked cut him off. Eleanor turned to see Caleb standing 30 feet away, his rifle leveled at Garrett's chest. He must have approached from the far side of the house, silent as a ghost. "You were leaving, Garrett." Caleb's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which somehow made it more terrifying. "And you won't be coming back." Garrett's hand moved toward the pistol at his hip, then stopped when Caleb's finger tightened visibly on the trigger. "Now, Mercer, I didn't mean anything." "Yes, you did. You came onto my property, insulted my wife, and threatened her. Those are 3 mistakes, Garrett. Most men don't get to make even one with me." Caleb took 3 steps forward, the rifle never wavering. "Ride out now. If I see you near my land or my wife again, I'll kill you. That's not a threat. It's a promise." The air crackled with violence barely restrained. Eleanor could see the calculation in Garrett's eyes, weighing his pride against his survival. Survival won. "This ain't over, Mercer," Garrett said, trying to salvage some dignity as he wheeled his horse around. "Yes, it is. Yes, it—" Caleb's voice followed him as he rode away. "Touch what's mine and you die. Spread that message to anyone else who might be confused about it." They watched until Garrett disappeared over the ridge. Then Caleb finally lowered the rifle. His hands, Eleanor noticed, were perfectly steady. No tremor, no sign of the adrenaline that was making her own limbs shake. "Are you all right?" he asked, turning to her. "Yes. He was crude and insulting, but he didn't touch me. He was thinking about it. I could see it in his eyes." Caleb's jaw tightened. "He won't be back, but there may be others. Word's gotten around that I have a wife now. Some men will see that as opportunity." "Opportunity for what?" "To test me, to see if marriage has made me soft." His eyes met hers, and Eleanor saw cold fury there, banked but burning. "To try to take what's mine." There was possession in his voice, but also protection. Eleanor realized she should probably object to being referred to as something owned, but in that moment, she couldn't find it in herself to care. She'd seen the alternative, men like Garrett who saw her as prey, and she knew which she preferred. "You called me your wife," she said quietly. "Not your housekeeper or your employee. Your wife." Caleb's expression shifted, something vulnerable flickering across his features. "You are my wife, Eleanor, in name and in law and apparently in fact. Anyone who forgets that will answer to me." That night, after a dinner where they were both too aware of what had happened, Caleb brought his rifle to the table and began his nightly cleaning ritual. Eleanor watched him work, the methodical precision with which he cared for the weapon that had defended her. "Thank you," she said finally, "for this afternoon. You don't need to thank me for protecting you. That's my responsibility." "It's more than that, though, isn't it?" Eleanor met his eyes. "You could have just ordered him off your land. Instead, you defended my honor." Caleb's hand stilled on the rifle. "He insulted you, threatened you. No man does that to my wife." "Even a wife you married out of practicality?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Caleb set down the cleaning cloth, his full attention on her now. "Eleanor, I won't lie to you. I married you because I needed someone to manage this household, because I was tired of being alone. Because I thought a practical arrangement would protect me from caring too much. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But somewhere in the past month, you've become more than just a convenient solution. You've become important. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. Important how? I'm not good with words. I don't know how to say what I feel. But I know that when Garrett looked at you with disrespect, something in me went cold and furious. I know that I listened for your footsteps in the morning, that your laugh, the few times I've heard it, is the best sound in this house. I know that the thought of anyone harming you makes me want to burn the world down. He stood abruptly, as though the words had cost him something. I'm going to check the perimeter, lock the door behind me. He left before Eleanor could respond, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts and the echo of his confession. She sat in the quiet house, processing what had just happened, what had shifted between them. Caleb Mercer was falling for her. And if she was honest with herself, she was falling for him too. This hard, dangerous, damaged man who was trying so hard to protect her from everything, including himself. When he returned an hour later, Eleanor was waiting. She'd made tea and she handed him a cup as he came through the door. I need to tell you something, she said, her courage nearly failing. I came here because I had no choice. I was desperate, terrified, alone. But I'm not staying out of desperation anymore, Caleb. I'm staying because I choose to, because you make me feel safe in a way I've never felt before. Because you see me as someone worth protecting, worth defending, worth everything, Caleb finished quietly. He set down the tea, his eyes locked on hers. You're worth everything, Eleanor. That scares me more than any violence I've ever faced. They stood in the flickering lamplight, the space between them charged with possibility and fear, and the beginning of something neither had planned for but both desperately needed. Eleanor took a step closer. I'm scared too, but I'm tired of making all my choices out of fear. Caleb's hand rose, hovering near her face, as though afraid to touch her. When Eleanor didn't pull away, he gently cupped her cheek, his calloused palm warm against her skin. I don't know how to be gentle, he whispered. I don't know how to love without losing everything. Then we'll learn together. Eleanor covered his hand with her own. We've both lost so much, Caleb. Maybe it's time we tried to build something instead. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her with a fierce tenderness that made Eleanor's eyes sting with tears. She could feel his heart pounding against her cheek, could feel the tremor in his hands that betrayed how much this moment meant to him. I'll protect you, he murmured into her hair. From everything and everyone. I swear it. I know, Eleanor whispered back. That's why I'm not afraid anymore. It wasn't entirely true. Fear still lurked at the edges of her consciousness, warnings about the violence she'd been told he was capable of, doubts about whether this fragile connection could survive the harshness of their world. But in Caleb's arms, those fears seemed manageable, overshadowed by the fierce certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. They stood together in the quiet house, two damaged people finding unexpected solace in each other. And Eleanor realized that survival wasn't just about enduring anymore. It was about choosing to live, to risk, to build something beautiful from the ashes of loss. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of coming winter. But inside, something warm and fragile and precious was beginning to grow. Something neither of them had dared hope for when they'd signed that practical contract. Something that looked remarkably like love. The warmth between them grew as autumn deepened into the kind of cold that bit through layers of wool and made the mountains gleam white against impossibly blue skies. Eleanor had been at the ranch for 2 months when she noticed the first signs that something had changed in Caleb beyond their growing affection for each other. He grew more watchful, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from his pistol, even when doing mundane tasks around the property. What's wrong? Eleanor asked one morning as she watched him check the rifle yet again, though he'd cleaned it thoroughly the night before. Caleb's jaw tightened. Probably nothing. Just a feeling. What kind of feeling? He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers running over the rifle's barrel with absent precision. The kind that's kept me alive this long. Someone's been watching the property. I found tracks near the North Ridge, boot prints that don't belong to any of our neighbors. Whoever it is, they're being careful to stay out of sight. Fear coiled in Eleanor's stomach. Should we report it to the sheriff? And tell him what? That I found some tracks? He'd say, "It's hunters passing through. Tell me not to worry." Caleb set the rifle aside, his pale eyes meeting hers. "I'm not worried, Eleanor. I'm prepared. There's a difference." But Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his attention fragmented even during their meals together, always listening for sounds that didn't belong. Whatever instinct was warning him, it was strong enough that he trusted it completely. The first cattle went missing 3 days later. Caleb discovered it during his morning check of the herd, returning to the house with his face carved from stone, fury radiating from him like heat from a forge. 5 head gone, cut from the herd deliberately, driven off to the northwest. Rustlers? Eleanor's hand went to her throat. Maybe, or someone sending a message. Email bullshit. He was already gathering supplies, checking ammunition, his movements sharp and efficient. "I'm going after them. I want you to stay in the house, keep the rifle close, and don't open the door for anyone but me. Understand?" "Caleb, maybe you should wait. Get help from town. By the time I ride to town and back, the trail will be cold, and those cattle will be gone forever." His voice was hard, clipped, but when he crossed to her, his hands were gentle on her shoulders. "I'll be fine, Eleanor. This isn't my first time tracking thieves, but I need to know you're safe here." She wanted to argue, to beg him not to go, but she saw the determination in his eyes and knew it would be useless. This was who he was, a man who protected what was his, who didn't wait for authority to solve his problems, who handled threats directly and decisively. "Promise me you'll be careful," she whispered. "Always am." He kissed her forehead, a gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks, then grabbed his rifle and headed for the barn. Eleanor watched from the window as he rode out on Ranger, following tracks only he could see, and felt dread settle over her like a shroud. The house seemed too quiet once he was gone, every creak and whisper of wind against the windows making her jump. She kept the rifle within reach as she went about her tasks, checking the doors repeatedly, her ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. He returned just before dusk, empty-handed and grim-faced. The cattle were gone, driven across the creek where the tracks disappeared into rocky ground. Whoever had taken them knew the country well enough to cover their trail. "This wasn't random," Caleb said as Eleanor served dinner, though neither of them had much appetite. "The cattle were cut from the herd too expertly, driven off by someone who knows ranching. And the tracks, I recognized the boot pattern. I've seen it before." "Where?" His hands clenched on the table. "Reed Callahan. He's got a small spread about 15 miles north. We've had history." The name meant nothing to Eleanor, but the way Caleb said it, with barely controlled rage, made her pulse quicken. "What kind of history?" "The Callahans were among the men who tried to run me off my land when I first claimed it. Reed and his 2 brothers, Seth and James. I gave them a chance to walk away. They chose violence instead." Caleb's voice was flat, emotionless, but his eyes burned. "I killed James. Seth took a bullet to the shoulder and hasn't been able to use his right arm properly since. Reed was the smart one. He saw how it was going and dragged Seth away before I could finish it." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "And you think he's come back for revenge?" "I think he's testing me, seeing if marriage has made me soft, if having you here has given him leverage." Caleb's gaze found hers, and she saw fear there beneath the anger. Not for himself, but for her. "I should have told you about this before. Should have warned you that my past might come calling." "What will you do?" "What I should have done 6 years ago. I'll ride to his place tomorrow, give him one chance to return my cattle and leave me alone. If he refuses—" Caleb didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The promise of violence hung heavy in the air between them. Eleanor reached across the table, covering his clenched fist with her hand. "Don't go alone. Please, take someone from town with you. The sheriff, maybe. The sheriff won't get involved in what he sees as a property dispute between ranchers, and I won't risk anyone else's life on my problems." His hand turned, fingers lacing with hers. "This is between me and Callahan. It has been for years." "Then I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not." The refusal was immediate and absolute. "You stay here where it's safe." "Safe?" Eleanor's voice rose despite her attempt to stay calm. You just said Callahan might be using me as leverage. How am I safer here alone than with you? Caleb opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, his jaw working. She could see him thinking, calculating risks, weighing options with that methodical mind that had kept him alive through war and frontier violence. If you come, he said finally, you do exactly as I say, when I say it. No arguments, no hesitation. Can you promise me that? Eleanor nodded, though fear made her throat tight. I promise. They left at first light, riding together for the first time since Eleanor's arrival. Caleb had spent the previous evening teaching her the basics of managing Sable, and though Eleanor was far from an accomplished rider, she managed well enough to keep pace. The mare was as gentle as Caleb had promised, responding to Eleanor's uncertain commands with patient tolerance. The ride to Callahan's property took them through increasingly rough country, following trails that wound between pine-covered ridges and across meadows already brown with the approach of winter. Caleb rode with his rifle across his saddle, his attention constantly scanning their surroundings, and Eleanor found herself doing the same, jumping at every bird that burst from cover, every branch that cracked in the wind. They crested a final ridge and looked down into a small valley where a ramshackle collection of buildings huddled against the hillside. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, and Eleanor could see cattle in a corral, more than seemed reasonable for such a small operation. There, Caleb said quietly, pointing. See those 5 in the near corner? Those are mine. I can tell by the brands even from here. What do we do? We ride down, I confront Callahan, and we see if he's smart enough to make this easy. But the tension in Caleb's voice suggested he didn't expect easy. They descended into the valley, and Eleanor's heart hammered so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. As they approached the house, a man emerged, tall, lean, with dark hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty in his eyes and the cruel set of his mouth. Reed Callahan, Eleanor thought. It had to be. Well, well, Callahan drawled, his gaze moving from Caleb to Eleanor and back again. Caleb Mercer. Heard you'd taken yourself a wife. Pretty little thing, ain't she? Though I gotta wonder what kind of woman would marry a killer. Caleb dismounted with deliberate slowness, every movement controlled. You've got 5 head of my cattle in your corral, Callahan. I'm giving you 1 chance to return them peacefully. Your cattle? Callahan's laugh was sharp, mocking. Now that's interesting, seeing as how I found these wandering on open range. Finders keepers, as they say. They're branded with my mark. You stole them, and we both know it. Caleb's hand rested on his pistol, not quite drawing, but making the threat clear. Return them now, and we'll call it settled. Refuse, and this ends badly for you. Callahan's eyes narrowed, and Eleanor saw calculation there, saw him weighing his chances against Caleb's reputation. Behind him, the door to the house opened and another man emerged, older, with a withered right arm hanging useless at his side. Seth, Eleanor realized. The brother Caleb had shot. You got some nerve coming here making threats, Mercer, Seth said, his voice rough with old pain and current hatred. Especially bringing your woman along. That's just careless. Everything happened very fast after that. Seth's good hand moved toward the rifle leaning against the doorframe. Caleb's pistol cleared its holster in a blur of motion, and suddenly Eleanor was staring at a scene that could turn into bloodshed in the space of a heartbeat. Don't, Caleb said, his voice deadly calm. Touch that rifle and I'll put a bullet through your head before your fingers close on it. I've already crippled you once, Seth. Don't make me finish the job. Seth froze, his hand inches from the rifle, murder in his eyes. Reed Callahan held up his hands in a gesture of peace that fooled no one. Now, let's all stay calm here. No need for anyone to get shot today. You want your cattle back, Mercer? Fine. Consider it a gift to celebrate your marriage. Seth, help drive those 5 head out of the corral. Reed, you can't just... Seth started. Do it. Reed's voice hardened. We'll settle this another way. Another time. The words sent ice down Eleanor's spine. This wasn't over. Callahan was simply choosing not to fight today, biding his time, planning something worse. Seth shambled toward the corral, shooting venomous looks at Caleb, while Reed kept talking, his voice smooth and dangerous. You know, Mercer, I gotta admire your stones, bringing your pretty wife out here. Shows you trust her to handle herself in rough company. Or maybe you're just using her as bait, seeing if I'll take a swing at you. Eleanor, stay on the horse, Caleb said quietly, his pistol still trained on Reed. Don't dismount. Don't speak. Just watch Seth with the cattle. Eleanor nodded, her hands tight on Sable's reins. She could feel the violence crackling in the air, thick as summer lightning, ready to break at any moment. Seth drove the 5 cattle out of the corral and toward them, his movements awkward and angry. As they passed, Caleb verified each brand, his attention never wavering from Reed. Satisfied? Reed asked. Got your property back. Now maybe you'll ride out and leave us in peace. This doesn't end here, Callahan. We both know it. Caleb's voice was soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it more terrifying. Whatever you're planning, whatever revenge you think you're owed, I'm telling you now, leave it alone. Take what's left of your pride and move on. Or what? You'll kill me like you killed James? Reed's mask of civility cracked, showing the hatred beneath. You took my brother from me, Mercer. You crippled Seth. You think I'm just going to forget that? Your brother drew on me first. Seth came at me armed and violent. I defended myself and my claim. Any man would have done the same. Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. But I'm not here to relitigate the past. I'm here to make sure you understand the present. You leave me and mine alone, or the next time we meet, I won't give you a chance to surrender. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, and Eleanor could see the years of bad blood between them, the violence that had shaped their relationship, the certainty on both sides that this feud would only end when one of them was dead. Finally, Reed smiled, a cold, cruel expression that made Eleanor's skin crawl. You know what I think, Mercer? I think that pretty wife of yours is your weakness now. I think you're not quite as willing to burn the world down when you've got something soft and breakable to protect. Caleb's gun hand never wavered, but Eleanor saw the muscle jump in his jaw. You threaten her, and I'll hunt you through hell itself, Callahan. There won't be a hole deep enough for you to hide in. Wasn't a threat, just an observation. Reed's eyes slid to Eleanor, cold and assessing. Ma'am, you might want to think about whether you've hitched yourself to the right man. Mercer here has a habit of getting people killed. Let's go, Caleb said to Eleanor, his voice tight with controlled fury. Drive the cattle ahead of us, nice and slow. Eleanor urged Sable forward, pushing the 5 head ahead of her while her heart raced and her hands shook on the reins. Behind her, she could hear Caleb backing Ranger away, could feel the weight of Reed and Seth Callahan's hatred following them like a physical force. They made it to the ridge before Eleanor allowed herself to look back. The Callahan brothers stood in front of their house, watching them go, and even from a distance, Eleanor could feel the menace radiating from them. He's going to come after us, she said quietly. I know. Caleb's voice was grim. Reed's been planning revenge for 6 years. Today just gave him more reason to follow through. The ride home was tense and silent, both of them watching their back trail, both expecting violence to erupt at any moment. By the time they reached the ranch, Eleanor's nerves were frayed to breaking, and she practically fell from Sable's saddle, her legs trembling. Caleb caught her, steadying her with hands that were surprisingly gentle, given the violence that had just been narrowly avoided. You did well, he said. Stayed calm, followed orders, didn't panic. I'm proud of you. The praise warmed her, but it couldn't quite dispel the cold knot of fear in her stomach. What happens now? Now we prepare. I reinforce the doors and windows, we keep weapons close, and we stay alert. He helped her toward the house, his eyes still scanning the horizon. Callahan will come eventually, men like him always do, but he'll choose his moment carefully, wait until he thinks he has an advantage. The days that followed were marked by a tension that never quite broke. Caleb worked around the property with renewed urgency, strengthening defenses, checking sightlines, making sure they had escape routes if needed. He taught Eleanor to shoot with deadly seriousness now, no longer patient instruction but urgent drilling, making her practice until she could hit targets consistently, even with her hands shaking. If they come, he told her one evening as they sat cleaning weapons together, and I go down, you take Sable and ride for town. Don't stop, don't look back, don't try to help me, just run. Promise me. Eleanor's throat tightened. Caleb, promise me, Eleanor. His hands covered hers, his eyes fierce. I can face anything as long as I know you'll survive. But if you stay and something happens to you because of me, because of my past. He couldn't finish the sentence, but she saw the fear in his face, the terror that his violence had finally found a target he couldn't bear to lose. I promise, she whispered, though the thought of leaving him to die made her feel sick. That night, lying in her bed across the hall from Caleb's room, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed amplified, the wind, the settling of the house, the distant cry of a wolf. She thought about the life she'd fled in Boston, about the desperation that had driven her west, about the strange, fierce man who'd become the center of her world. She thought about Reed Callahan's cold eyes and his promise of revenge, and she thought about the tiny, terrifying secret she'd been carrying for the past 2 weeks, the one she hadn't yet found the courage to tell Caleb. She was pregnant. The realization had come slowly, missed monthly courses, morning queasiness, a tenderness in her breasts. Eleanor had tried to deny it at first, but the signs were unmistakable. She was carrying Caleb's child, conceived during one of the nights after they'd stopped sleeping in separate rooms, when their practical marriage had transformed into something real and consuming. She should have told him immediately, but the words stuck in her throat every time she tried, because she knew what it would mean to him. Another person to protect, another vulnerability his enemies could exploit, another potential loss to add to the grief that already haunted him. Now, with Callahan's threat hanging over them like a blade, Eleanor knew she couldn't keep the secret any longer. Caleb needed to know, needed to be able to make his decisions with full knowledge of what was at stake. She rose from bed, pulled on her robe, and crossed the hall to his room. The door was ajar. Caleb never fully closed it anymore, always listening for threats, and she could see him sitting by the window, silhouetted against the moonlight, a rifle across his lap. "Caleb?" Her voice was barely a whisper. He turned, instantly alert. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine. I need to tell you something." Eleanor crossed to him, her heart hammering. "Something important." He set the rifle aside, giving her his full attention. In the moonlight, his face was all sharp angles and shadows, beautiful and dangerous and deeply beloved. "I'm pregnant," Eleanor said, the words tumbling out before she could lose her nerve. "About 2 months, I think. I've been trying to find the right time to tell you, but with everything happening with Callahan, I'm sorry I waited." Caleb went absolutely still, so motionless he might have been carved from stone. For a long, terrible moment, he said nothing, and Eleanor's heart sank. Then he stood, crossed to her in 2 strides, and pulled her into his arms with a fierceness that took her breath away. "A baby," he whispered against her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "We're going to have a baby. You're not angry that I didn't tell you sooner?" "Angry?" He pulled back to look at her, and Eleanor saw tears gleaming in his eyes, the first time she'd ever seen him cry. "Eleanor, you've just given me something I never thought I'd have again. Hope for a future, a family, something to build instead of just protect." His hands cupped her face, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "I'm terrified, yes. But angry? Never." They held each other in the moonlit room, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her. Not just the tiny life growing in her womb, but her own heart, expanding to encompass this man and the fierce, protective love he offered. "We need to end this thing with Callahan," Caleb said finally, his voice hardening with resolve. "Before the baby comes. Before you're more vulnerable. I won't have you and our child living under threat. What will you do?" "Whatever it takes." The promise in those words was dark and absolute. "I'll give him one more chance to walk away. If he refuses, I'll end him. I won't let anyone threaten my family, Eleanor. Not ever again." The attack came 2 weeks later on a night when the moon was dark and clouds obscured the stars. Eleanor woke to Caleb's hand over her mouth, his voice urgent in her ear. "Don't scream. Get dressed, quickly and quietly. They're here." Terror flooded through her, but she forced herself to move, pulling on her dress with shaking hands while Caleb gathered weapons. Through the window, she could see nothing but darkness, could hear nothing unusual, but she trusted his instincts completely. "How many?" she whispered. At least 3, maybe more. They're surrounding the house. Caleb pressed a pistol into her hand, his face grim. Remember what I taught you. If someone comes through that door who isn't me, you shoot them. Don't hesitate. Don't warn them. Just shoot. A crash from downstairs made them both freeze. Glass shattering, the sound of the front door being kicked in, boot steps heavy on the wooden floor. "Eleanor Mercer!" Reed Callahan's voice echoed through the house, slurred and angry. Come out wherever you are. Time to settle accounts." Caleb's hand found hers in the darkness, squeezing once. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me. Whatever you hear, don't come out." Caleb, no! But he was already moving, rifle in hand, heading for the stairs with the kind of deadly purpose that made him more predator than man. Eleanor heard the door lock click, heard his footsteps descending, heard Reed Callahan's mocking laughter cut short by Caleb's voice, cold and hard. "You made a mistake coming here, Reed." The gunshot that followed was deafening, then another, then more in rapid succession. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, the pistol clutched in her trembling hands, listening to violence erupt below her. Shouts, curses, the crash of furniture breaking, the wet thud of fists hitting flesh. She wanted to run down, to help Caleb, but his orders kept her frozen. "Stay here. Lock the door. Don't come out." More gunshots, closer now, someone screaming in pain. The house shook as bodies slammed against walls. Then silence, sudden and complete. Eleanor's breath came in ragged gasps as she waited, praying, pleading with every force she could think of that Caleb was still alive down there. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one an eternity. Footsteps on the stairs, heavy and slow. Eleanor raised the pistol, her hands shaking so badly she could barely aim. The footsteps reached the landing, paused outside her door. "Eleanor?" Caleb's voice, rough and pained. "It's me. Open the door." She fumbled with the lock, wrenched the door open, and gasped. Caleb stood there, covered in blood, his shirt torn, a gash across his forehead, his knuckles split and raw. But he was standing, alive, and that was all that mattered. "Are you hurt?" Eleanor reached for him, trying to assess the damage. "Not my blood, mostly." He swayed, catching himself against the doorframe. Callahan brought 4 men. 2 are dead. 2 ran when they saw how it was going. Reed himself. Caleb's expression hardened. "He's downstairs, still breathing, but he won't be causing problems anymore." Eleanor followed him down the stairs, her stomach churning at the carnage. 2 bodies lay sprawled in the main room, one near the broken door, another by the overturned table. Blood spattered the walls, darkened the floor, made the air thick with the copper stench of violence. Reed Callahan lay propped against the wall, clutching his side where blood seeped between his fingers. His face was a mask of pain and hatred, his breath coming in wet, labored gasps. Caleb stood over him, rifle pointed at his head. "You should have walked away, Reed. I gave you chances. Now look what your revenge cost you." "Go to hell, Mercer," Reed wheezed. Should have killed you when I had the chance." "Yes," Caleb agreed quietly. "You should have, but you thought you were clever, thought you'd hurt me through my wife. That was your fatal mistake." His finger tightened on the trigger. "Any last words?" Eleanor's hand closed on Caleb's arm. "Don't." He looked at her, surprise flickering across his blood-streaked face. "Eleanor, this man tried to kill us. Tried to kill you and our child." "I know, but if you kill him now, like this, it's murder. Not self-defense, not protection, just revenge." Her voice steadied as she spoke, drawing on strength she hadn't known she possessed. "You're better than that, Caleb. We're better than that." For a long moment, Caleb stared at her, and Eleanor could see the war raging behind his eyes, the ingrained instinct to eliminate threats permanently warring with the man he was trying to become, the father he wanted to be. Finally, slowly, he lowered the rifle. "You're right," he said, his voice rough. "I'll ride for the sheriff. Let the law handle this." He looked down at Reed. "But understand this, Callahan. If you ever come near my family again, law or no law, I will end you. That's not a threat. It's a promise." Reed's laugh was more of a cough, blood flecking his lips. "Big talk. From a man who lets his woman make his decisions. Caleb's boot connected with Reed's wounded side, drawing a scream. "My woman," he said coldly, "just saved your worthless life. I'd show some gratitude if I were you." He turned to Eleanor, his expression softening. "Can you watch him while I ride for the sheriff? Keep the rifle on him. If he moves, shoot him in the leg." Eleanor nodded, taking the rifle with hands that had finally stopped shaking. "I can do that." Caleb kissed her forehead, gentle despite the violence he'd just committed, despite the blood that stained them both. "I'll be back as soon as I can. Lock the door behind me." He rode out into the darkness, and Eleanor stood watch over Reed Callahan and the bodies of his men, over the wreckage of their home and the blood that stained everything, and understood with terrible clarity that this was what love meant in this harsh place. Violence and protection intertwined, survival measured in bullets and choices, family forged in fire and defended with absolute ferocity. Outside, the first light of dawn began to touch the sky, and Eleanor placed her free hand over her belly, over the child growing there, and silently promised that their baby would grow up knowing both sides of its father, the dangerous man who would kill to protect them, and the gentle one who had chosen mercy when vengeance would have been easier. Both men were real, both were necessary, and Eleanor loved them equally. The sheriff arrived with Caleb just as full daylight broke over the mountains, bringing with him a deputy and the town doctor. Sheriff Tom Hendricks was a grizzled man in his 50s who'd seen enough frontier violence to be unfazed by the carnage in Caleb's house, but his eyes softened with concern when he saw Eleanor standing there with the rifle, her dress stained with blood that wasn't hers, her face pale but resolute. "Mrs. Mercer," he said gently, "you can put the weapon down now. We've got this handled." Eleanor lowered the rifle, her arms trembling from having held it steady for over an hour. Caleb was beside her instantly, taking the weapon from her shaking hands and pulling her against his chest. She could hear his heart hammering, could feel the tension still coiled in his muscles despite the immediate danger having passed. The doctor knelt beside Reed Callahan, examining the wound in his side with professional efficiency. "He'll live, but he needs surgery to remove the bullet. We'll need to get him to town quickly." "Do what you need to do," Sheriff Hendricks said, then turned his attention to the two dead men. "Anyone know who they are?" "Drifters Reed hired," Caleb said, his voice flat. "Probably promised them money or a share of my cattle to help him settle an old score. Their names don't matter. They made their choice when they broke into my home in the middle of the night." Hendricks walked the room, taking in the broken door, the shattered windows, the evidence of the violent struggle that had taken place. "Walk me through what happened, Mercer, start to finish." Caleb recounted the night's events with the same methodical precision he applied to everything, waking to the sounds of intruders, the attack, the fight that had followed. His voice never wavered, never showed emotion, as though he were describing someone else's experience rather than his own near death. "Reed Callahan has been threatening me and my wife for weeks," Caleb concluded. "Stole my cattle, made it clear he wanted revenge for what happened 6 years ago when he and his brothers tried to run me off my land. I defended my property then, and I defended my home and my pregnant wife tonight. Everything I did was in self-defense, Sheriff. You can verify that with Eleanor." Hendricks turned to Eleanor, his expression kind but probing. "That true, ma'am? Your husband acted in self-defense?" Eleanor nodded, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "They broke into our home. Reed Callahan called my name, threatened us. Caleb gave them every chance to leave. When they wouldn't, he protected us. That's all that happened here, Sheriff, a man defending his family." The sheriff studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I've known Caleb Mercer for 7 years. He's a hard man, no question, but he's never been the aggressor. Reed Callahan, on the other hand..." He gestured to where the doctor was preparing to transport the wounded man. "This isn't his first time causing trouble. Last year, he was accused of claim jumping down in Silver Creek, and there have been questions about how he manages to keep his ranch running when he never seems to do any actual work." "He's a thief and a coward," Caleb said quietly. "Always has been. Figured he could hide behind numbers this time, bring enough men to overwhelm me. He was wrong." The deputy, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, was examining the bodies with a greenish tint to his face. "Sheriff, what do we do with these two?" We'll take them back to town, notify any kin they might have. As for Callahan, Hendricks walked over to where Reed lay propped against the wall, now bandaged but still bleeding through. Reed Callahan, I'm arresting you for attempted murder, breaking and entering, and conspiracy to commit violence. If you survive your surgery, you'll stand trial. If you don't, well, you brought that on yourself. Reed's eyes found Caleb, burning with hatred despite his pain. This isn't over, Mercer. You think the law's going to protect you? I've got friends, people who owe me, then they can visit you in prison. Hendricks cut him off sharply. Assuming the judge doesn't hang you, which he very well might given you attacked a pregnant woman in her own home. Montana Territory doesn't look kindly on that kind of behavior. As the sheriff and his men worked to remove the bodies and transport Reed to town, Caleb led Eleanor upstairs to their bedroom, away from the blood and chaos. He sat her on the bed, kneeling in front of her, his hands gentle on her knees. Are you all right? He asked, his voice rough with concern. The baby. We're fine. Scared, but fine. Eleanor's hands covered his, and she noticed they were both trembling now that the crisis had passed. Caleb, what you did tonight. I killed 2 men. The words were stark, brutal. Shot one in the chest, broke the other's neck with my bare hands. I would have killed Reed too if you hadn't stopped me. You protected us. That's what you did. Eleanor cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. Those men came here to kill you, to hurt me, maybe to take me hostage to use against you. You did what you had to do. I've killed before, Caleb said, his voice breaking. During the war, after it, men who threatened me or tried to take what was mine. I've always been able to justify it, to tell myself it was necessary. But tonight, when I heard Callahan calling your name, when I knew they'd come for you, his hands tightened on her knees. I've never felt rage like that, Eleanor. It was like something broke open inside me, something dark and terrible that wanted to burn the world down to keep you safe. Eleanor pulled him up to sit beside her, wrapping her arms around him as he buried his face against her shoulder. She could feel him shaking, could feel the aftermath of violence and fear working through his body in tremors he couldn't control. You didn't burn the world down, she whispered. You protected our home. You fought with precision and skill, not rage. And when I asked you to spare Reed's life, you listened. That's not a monster, Caleb. That's a man trying to be better than his worst instincts. They sat together as the sun rose higher, holding each other while the sounds of the sheriff's work drifted up from below. Eventually, Hendricks called up the stairs that they were leaving, that he'd need statements from both of them in town within the next few days, but that for now they should rest. After the lawmen had gone, taking the bodies and Reed Callahan with them, Caleb and Eleanor were left alone in their violated home. The silence was oppressive, heavy with the weight of what had happened, broken only by the wind through the shattered windows. We need to clean this up, Eleanor said finally, looking at the blood-stained floor, the broken furniture, the bullet holes in the walls. Not you, you need to rest. Caleb stood, wincing as bruised muscles protested. I'll handle it. We'll handle it together. Eleanor's voice was firm. This is our home, Caleb. We'll put it right together. They spent the day scrubbing blood from floorboards, repairing what could be fixed and making note of what would need replacing. It was grim work, made harder by Eleanor's occasional waves of nausea and Caleb's injuries. He moved stiffly, favoring his left side where someone had landed a knife that had fortunately only grazed ribs rather than sinking deep. As they worked, they talked, really talked, in a way they hadn't before. Caleb told her about the war, about the things he'd seen and done that still haunted his dreams, about coming home to find his family dead and having nothing left but rage and grief, about claiming this land and defending it because it was the only thing he had to anchor himself to, the only purpose that kept him from drowning in the darkness. Eleanor told him about her mother's slow death, about the helplessness of watching someone you love fade away while being unable to help, about the mill and the foreman whose attention had grown increasingly threatening, about the desperate calculation that had led her to answer Caleb's advertisement, weighing potential danger against certain misery and choosing the unknown. I was so scared when I first arrived, Eleanor admitted as she scrubbed at a stubborn bloodstain. Everyone warned me you were dangerous, that I was making a terrible mistake. Part of me believed them. They weren't wrong, Caleb said quietly. I am dangerous. What happened last night proved that. You're dangerous to people who threaten what you love. There's a difference. Eleanor sat back on her heels, looking at him across the scarred floorboards. The man who brings me books and fixes things I mention in passing and teaches me to shoot so I can protect myself. That's who you really are, Caleb. The violence is it's just what you do to protect the gentle things. His throat worked as he swallowed hard. I don't want our child to grow up seeing me as a killer. I don't want to be that man anymore. Then don't be. Eleanor moved to sit beside him, taking his scarred, blood-stained hands in hers. Reed Callahan is arrested. His men are dead or scattered. The threat is over. You can choose now. Choose what kind of man you want to be, what kind of father. It's not that simple. There will always be another Reed Callahan, another threat, another reason to fight. Maybe, but you can choose how you respond to those threats. You can choose to use the law when possible, violence only when necessary. You can choose to be the man who builds things instead of just destroying them. She placed his hand on her belly, where their child grew. This baby deserves a father who knows when to fight and when to walk away, who can be both strong and gentle. I think you can be that man, Caleb. I've seen glimpses of him. He stared at his hand on her belly, his expression a mix of wonder and fear. What if I can't change? What if the violence is too deep in me? Then I'll remind you who you are, every day if I have to. Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. We'll build something good here, Caleb. A home, a family, a life that's about more than just survival. But you have to want it too. You have to choose it. They finished cleaning as the day wore toward evening, and by the time they were done, the house looked almost normal again. The broken windows were boarded up temporarily, the bullet holes patched, the blood scrubbed away. The physical evidence of violence was gone, but Eleanor knew it would take longer to erase the emotional scars. That night, Caleb had nightmares. Eleanor woke to the sound of him thrashing in his bed across the hall, muttering words she couldn't make out. She went to him, found him tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, his face twisted in anguish. Caleb, she said softly, touching his shoulder. Wake up, you're dreaming. His eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused, and for a moment he didn't recognize her. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist hard enough to bruise, and Eleanor gasped. Then awareness flooded back into his expression, and he released her immediately, horror replacing the blankness. I hurt you. I'm sorry. I didn't... It's all right. You were asleep. You didn't know it was me. Eleanor sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing her wrist. What were you dreaming about? Caleb sat up, running shaking hands through his hair. The war. Things I haven't thought about in years. Men I killed. Men who died beside me. And then it shifted, and it was last night, except in the dream, I was too slow, and they got to you first. I heard you screaming, and I couldn't reach you, and... His voice broke. Eleanor pulled him into her arms, holding him while he fought for control. She could feel his heart racing, could feel the tremors running through his body. This strong, dangerous man was terrified, not of violence or death, but of failing to protect the people he loved. I'm here, she whispered. I'm safe. We're both safe. For now. But what about next time? What about when the baby comes, and I'm out with the herd, and someone decides to try again? The words tumbled out in a rush. I can't be everywhere, Eleanor. I can't protect you every moment. And the thought of something happening to you, to our child, because of my past, because of who I am... Stop. Eleanor pulled back to look at him, her hands framing his face. You can't control everything, Caleb. You can prepare, you can be vigilant, but you cannot guarantee perfect safety. No one can. All we can do is live our lives as fully as possible and handle threats as they come. How are you so calm about this? His voice was raw with anguish. After what happened, how can you just... Because I choose to trust you. I choose to believe that we'll face whatever comes together. And I choose to believe that the life we're building is worth the risk. She placed his hand on her belly again. This baby is going to be born into a world with danger in it. That's unavoidable. But they'll also be born into a world with you in it, a father who will move heaven and earth to keep them safe. That's worth something, Caleb. That's worth everything. He stared at her for a long moment, then pulled her close again, burying his face in her hair. I don't deserve you. Yes, you do. You just don't believe it yet. They stayed like that until his breathing steadied and his heartbeat slowed to normal. Eleanor knew she should return to her own bed, but she couldn't bring herself to leave him alone with his demons. Instead, she lay down beside him, fully clothed, and let him wrap himself around her like she was the only solid thing in a shifting world. Eleanor? His voice was barely a whisper in the darkness. I love you. I should have said it before, but I didn't know how. I'm not good with words, with feelings, but I love you more than I've ever loved anything, and the thought of losing you terrifies me more than any violence ever has. Tears stung Eleanor's eyes. I love you too, even when you're stubborn and closed off and trying to protect me from things I don't need protecting from. I love all of you, Caleb. The dangerous parts and the gentle parts, all of it. The days that followed were a strange mix of healing and adjustment. Caleb threw himself into repairing the damage to their home with an almost manic energy, as though by fixing the physical wounds he could somehow erase the trauma of the attack. New windows were installed, the front door replaced with one that was heavier and more secure, locks added that could withstand more than a determined kick. But Eleanor could see the toll it was taking on him, the way he startled at unexpected sounds, the dark circles under his eyes from too many sleepless nights, the way his hand drifted to his pistol at the slightest provocation. The violence he'd committed in defense of their home had reopened old wounds, brought back memories he'd tried to bury. A week after the attack, they rode to town to give their statements to Sheriff Hendricks. The townspeople stared as they passed, and Eleanor could hear the whispers, the speculation about what had happened at the Mercer Ranch. Some looked at Caleb with fear, others with respect. A few women gave Eleanor pitying looks, as though she were a lamb who'd willingly walked into a wolf's den. In the sheriff's office, they recounted the attack once more for the official record. Hendricks listened carefully, making notes, asking clarifying questions with professional detachment. Reed Callahan survived the surgery, he told them when they'd finished. He's locked up tight, and the circuit judge will be here in 3 weeks to hear the case. Given the evidence and the number of witnesses who can testify to his threats against you, I expect he'll hang or spend the rest of his life in prison. And his brother Seth, Caleb asked. Disappeared. Probably headed to California or somewhere else far from here. He knows he's wanted as an accessory. Hendricks leaned back in his chair, studying Caleb with eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to be easily shocked. I've been sheriff here for 12 years, Mercer. I've seen men like you before. Men who've got violence in their bones but try to live peaceful lives anyway. It's a hard balance to maintain. I'm trying, Sheriff. I'm trying to be better than I was. I know you are. And from what I've seen, you're succeeding. Hendricks' gaze shifted to Eleanor. You've got a good woman there who believes in you. Don't make her regret that faith. I won't, Caleb said quietly. I promise you that. As they left the sheriff's office, they ran into Thomas Garrett, the rancher who'd insulted Eleanor weeks earlier. He stood on the boardwalk, blocking their path, his expression a mix of calculation and false friendliness. Mercer, he said with a nod, heard about your trouble with Callahan. Rough business, that. It's handled. Caleb's voice was flat, his body tense. I'm sure it is. You've always been good at handling problems. Permanently. Garrett's eyes slid to Eleanor. Mrs. Mercer, I wanted to apologize for my rudeness when last we met. I was out of line. Eleanor could feel Caleb coiling beside her, could sense violence gathering like a storm. She put a hand on his arm, squeezing gently. Apology accepted, Mr. Garrett. Now, if you'll excuse us. She steered Caleb away before the situation could escalate, feeling his muscles bunched tight beneath her hand. They'd made it halfway down the street when he spoke, his voice rough with suppressed anger. He's not sorry. He's just scared now that he knows I'll defend you without hesitation. Probably. But does it matter? We got the apology, we maintained our dignity, and we walked away without violence. That's growth, Caleb. Eleanor squeezed his arm again. You're learning to choose your battles. Some of the tension eased from his shoulders. You're teaching me to choose my battles. There's a difference. They stopped at the general store to replenish supplies, and the proprietor, a kindly woman named Mrs. Chen, fussed over Eleanor when she learned about the pregnancy. You take care of yourself, dear, she said, adding extra items to their order. Herbs for nausea, fabric for baby clothes, a book on childbirth and infant care. First babies can be difficult, and you're out there so isolated. If you need anything at all, you send that husband of yours to fetch me. I've delivered half the babies in this county." The kindness brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, and she thanked Mrs. Chen profusely. As they loaded their supplies into the wagon, she noticed Caleb was quieter than usual, his expression thoughtful. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. How different things could have been. If I'd come to this town 7 years ago with the intention of being part of a community instead of just surviving alone, defending my claim with violence and isolation. He helped her up into the wagon seat, his hands lingering on her waist. I pushed people away because I thought it was safer, thought being alone meant no one could hurt me, but it just made me harder, more willing to resort to violence because I had nothing to lose. "And now you have everything to lose," Eleanor said softly. "Yes, and that should make me more dangerous, more willing to fight. But instead, it makes me want to find other ways. Because every fight I get into, every enemy I make, puts you and the baby at risk." He climbed up beside her, taking the reins but not yet urging the horses forward. "Mrs. Chen was kind to you today. So was the doctor when he checked on you after the attack. Even the sheriff seems to respect us more now that we handled things through legal channels. Maybe there's something to this community thing after all." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder as they rode out of town, hope blooming warm in her chest. This was what she'd been waiting for, Caleb beginning to see a path forward that didn't rely solely on his ability to outfight and outshoot his enemies. Beginning to understand that strength could be found in connection as much as in isolation. The weeks passed, marked by the slow transition from autumn to winter. Snow dusted the mountains, and the air turned sharp and cold. Eleanor's pregnancy began to show, a gentle swelling that Caleb watched with a mix of wonder and protectiveness that would have been comical if it weren't so touching. He started building a cradle in the barn, working on it during the evenings by lamplight. Eleanor would sit nearby, sewing baby clothes from the fabric Mrs. Chen had sold them, and they would talk about the future in a way that felt almost normal, almost peaceful. "We should think about a name," Eleanor said one evening, holding up a tiny shirt she'd just finished. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him after your father, if you're comfortable with that." Caleb's hand stilled on the cradle's rocker he was shaping. "John. My father's name was John." His voice was thick with emotion. "He would have loved you, Eleanor, would have loved knowing his name would continue." "And if it's a girl?" "Margaret, after your mother." He looked up, his eyes soft in the lamplight. "So she's remembered, so our daughter knows about the woman who raised someone as strong as you." Eleanor had to set aside her sewing as tears blurred her vision. "You're a better man than you think you are, Caleb Mercer. I'm trying to be the man you deserve, that's all." The circuit judge arrived in late November, bringing with him the machinery of frontier justice. Reed Callahan's trial was held in the town hall, with half the county in attendance. Eleanor and Caleb both testified, recounting the threats, the cattle theft, the night of the attack. Other witnesses spoke as well. Hoskins, the stage driver, mentioned warning Eleanor about Callahan. Neighbors testified to seeing suspicious activity around the Mercer Ranch. The doctor described the wounds he'd treated. Reed Callahan, pale and diminished in prison clothes, offered little defense. His lawyer tried to argue self-defense, tried to paint Caleb as the aggressor, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than an hour, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in the territorial prison, sparing him the noose but ensuring he'd never threaten anyone again. As the guards led him away, Callahan's eyes found Caleb one last time. "I hope it was worth it, Mercer," he said, his voice bitter. "I hope she was worth everything you destroyed." Caleb stood, Eleanor's hand clasped firmly in his. "She was worth everything and more. And unlike you, I'll live to see my children grow up. I'd say I got the better end of this bargain." They left the courthouse together, stepping out into the crisp winter air. Around them, townspeople nodded respectfully, a few even offering congratulations on the pregnancy. Eleanor could feel the shift. They were no longer outsiders, no longer the dangerous man and his mysterious bride. They were becoming part of the community, establishing roots that went deeper than violence and fear. That night, in the safety of their repaired home, Caleb held Eleanor close and whispered his gratitude into her hair. Gratitude for her strength during the attack, for her wisdom in sparing Callahan's life, for choosing to build something with him instead of running from his darkness. "You saved me," he told her. "Not just that night, but every day since you arrived. You showed me there was another way to live, another way to be strong. You gave me hope when I'd forgotten what that felt like." Eleanor turned in his arms, her hands coming up to frame his face. "We saved each other, Caleb. I was drowning in Boston, and you threw me a lifeline. Now we're both learning to swim, instead of just surviving." They made love that night with a tenderness that spoke of new beginnings, of futures carefully built instead of violently defended. And as Eleanor drifted to sleep in Caleb's arms, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From desperate mail-order bride to cherished wife, from terrified stranger to equal partner in building a life worth living. The dangerous man she'd been warned about had become the gentle soul she'd needed all along, and the practical marriage she'd entered had transformed into a love deeper and more fierce than anything she'd imagined possible. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the ranch in white silence, covering the scars of violence with the promise of renewal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles, the endless work of building a life in harsh country. But tonight, they had each other. They had their growing child, and they had the hard-won knowledge that love could survive anything when both people chose it every single day. That, Eleanor thought as sleep claimed her, was worth every risk she'd taken, every fear she'd faced, every moment of uncertainty that had brought her to this place, this man, this life. It was worth everything. Winter settled over the ranch with a quiet persistence that matched the rhythm Eleanor and Caleb were building together. The snow came in waves, blanketing the valley in white silence, transforming the landscape into something both beautiful and treacherous. Caleb worked harder than ever to prepare for the season, stocking the root cellar, repairing the barn roof, ensuring the cattle had adequate shelter and feed for the months ahead. Eleanor watched her belly grow round with their child and felt a contentment she'd never imagined possible. The morning sickness had passed, replaced by an energy that drove her to prepare their home for the baby's arrival. She sewed tiny clothes, organized supplies, and transformed the small room adjacent to their bedroom into a nursery. The cradle Caleb had built sat in the corner, its wood polished to a honey glow, waiting for the life they'd created together. On a particularly cold morning in late December, Eleanor was kneading bread dough when she heard horses approaching. Her hands stilled, old fear rising despite the months that had passed since the attack. Caleb was in the barn, close enough to reach quickly if needed, but the sound of multiple riders still made her pulse quicken. She moved to the window and felt relief wash over her when she recognized Sheriff Hendricks and another man she didn't know, older, distinguished-looking, wearing a badge that caught the winter sunlight. Caleb emerged from the barn as they dismounted, his rifle carried casually but his posture alert. Eleanor grabbed her shawl and stepped onto the porch, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. "Sheriff," Caleb said by way of greeting, his eyes moving to the stranger. "What brings you out in this weather?" "Caleb, Eleanor." Hendricks nodded to them both. "This is U.S. Marshal Davis from Denver. He's got some news about the Callahan situation." Marshal Davis stepped forward, his weathered face grave but not unkind. "Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Mercer, I'm afraid I have difficult news. Reed Callahan died 3 days ago in the territorial prison. Pneumonia," the doctor said. "His lungs were never the same after the bullet wound." Eleanor felt Caleb go still beside her. She reached for his hand, finding it clenched into a fist, and gently worked her fingers into his until he relaxed enough to grip hers. "I see," Caleb said quietly. "Thank you for informing us, Marshal." "There's more." Davis pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Before he died, Callahan signed a confession. Seems facing his mortality put things in perspective. He admitted to the cattle theft, to planning the attack on your home, and to several other crimes we'd suspected him of but couldn't prove. He also made a statement clearing you of any wrongdoing, stating explicitly that you acted in self-defense both 6 years ago and during the recent attack." Caleb took the document, his hand trembling slightly as he unfolded it. Eleanor watched his eyes move across the page, reading words that absolved him of crimes that had haunted him for years. "Why would he do this?" Caleb asked, his voice rough with emotion he was struggling to contain. Prison chaplain said Callahan wanted to make peace before he died. Said he'd spent 6 years consumed by revenge, and it had cost him everything: his freedom, his health, his brother who fled west and hasn't been heard from since. He said, and I'm quoting here, "Mercer was right to defend what was his. I was wrong to come after him. Let that be known so his wife and child don't carry the weight of my mistakes." Marshall Davis paused, letting the words settle. "It's not often a man faces his own darkness that honestly, Mr. Mercer, thought you should know." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at Caleb. His jaw was working, his throat moving as he swallowed repeatedly, fighting for control. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't want him to die. I wanted him to serve his time, to maybe find some peace. I wanted to prove that I could choose mercy over revenge." "You did prove that," Sheriff Hendricks said firmly. "You spared his life when you could have killed him. You let the law handle justice. That confession is Callahan's way of acknowledging that, of saying you were the better man." After the lawmen left, Caleb stood on the porch holding the confession, staring at nothing. Eleanor came up beside him, wrapping her shawl around them both despite the cold. "How do you feel?" she asked gently. "I don't know. Relieved, I think, but also sad. Reed Callahan spent the last years of his life eaten alive by hatred, and for what? His brother's dead, Seth's gone, and he died in a prison cell instead of on his own land. All that violence, all that rage, and it accomplished nothing but misery." Caleb folded the confession carefully, as though it were something precious. "I could have ended up the same way, Eleanor. If you hadn't come here, if you hadn't shown me there was another path, I might have died old and alone and bitter, still fighting ghosts. But you didn't. You chose differently." Eleanor leaned against him, sharing warmth. "We both did." That night, Caleb built a fire in the hearth and burned several things he'd kept hidden in a trunk. Letters from his sister that reminded him of all he'd lost, newspaper clippings about the men he'd killed, a journal he'd kept during the war filled with darkness and violence. Eleanor watched the flames consume his past, understanding that this was a ritual of letting go, of choosing to carry only what served their future. "I want our child to know I fought when necessary," Caleb said as the last pages curled and blackened. "But I don't want them to know the details, to carry the weight of every violent act I've committed. I want them to know their father as a man who built things, who protected his family, who chose love over hate." "Then that's who you'll be," Eleanor said simply. "That's who you already are." January brought deep snows that isolated them for weeks at a time. Caleb strung a rope from the house to the barn so he could tend the animals even in blizzards that reduced visibility to nothing. Eleanor spent the long evenings reading aloud from the books Caleb had bought her, their favorites becoming the stories they planned to share with their child someday. The baby moved constantly now, little feet pressing against Eleanor's ribs, tiny fists pushing at the walls of their confined world. Caleb would place his large, scarred hands on her belly and marvel at each movement, his face transformed with wonder. "Strong," he'd murmur, feeling a particularly vigorous kick, just like their mother. "Stubborn, more like," Eleanor would reply, shifting to ease the pressure. "Just like their father." In February, Mrs. Chen made the treacherous journey out to the ranch, bringing supplies and her considerable experience as a midwife. She examined Eleanor thoroughly, pronounced both mother and baby healthy, and proceeded to terrify Caleb with detailed explanations of what to expect during the birth. "You've faced down armed men without flinching," Mrs. Chen told him as he went progressively paler. "But watching your wife in labor will test you in ways violence never has. The key is to trust the process and do exactly as I tell you." "I'm good at following orders," Caleb managed weakly. "We'll see." Mrs. Chen patted his arm with amusement. "I've seen the toughest men faint at the sight of childbirth, but you strike me as having a spine of iron, Mr. Mercer. I think you'll manage." She stayed 3 days, teaching both of them what to expect, what to prepare, what signs meant immediate action versus normal progression. When she finally departed, leaving behind a detailed list of instructions and promising to return when Eleanor's time came, Caleb looked both more prepared and more terrified than before. What if something goes wrong? He asked Eleanor that night as they lay in bed, his hand resting protectively on her belly. What if I can't protect you from this? Then we'll face it together, just like we've faced everything else. Eleanor covered his hand with hers. Birth is dangerous, yes, but women have been doing this since the beginning of time. I'm strong, the baby's healthy, and we have Mrs. Chen's expertise to guide us. That's more than most frontier women have. I know, His voice broke. I can't lose you, Eleanor. You and this baby are everything to me. If something happened, nothing's going to happen. Eleanor turned to face him, her belly pressed between them, their child moving in that small space. I refuse to let fear steal our joy. We've fought too hard for this happiness to let worry poison it now. March arrived with the first hints of spring, snow melting in patches, the sound of water running in the creek, birds returning from their winter migrations. Eleanor's body grew heavy and unwieldy, her back aching constantly, her sleep interrupted by the baby's acrobatics, and her own need to relieve herself every hour. She was hanging laundry on a bright morning in late March when the first pain hit, low and deep, stealing her breath. She gripped the clothesline, breathing through it, recognizing immediately what it meant. Their child was ready to be born. Caleb was mending fence in the north pasture when she found him, walking slowly, stopping twice more as contractions rippled through her. His face went white when he saw her expression. It's time, she said simply. Bed. He was off his horse and beside her in seconds, his hands fluttering nervously as though he wanted to touch her, but was afraid she might break. How long? How close are the pains? Should I ride for Mrs. Chen? They just started. We have time. Eleanor managed a smile despite the discomfort. But yes, you should fetch her. And Caleb? Ride safe. I need you whole. He kissed her fiercely, then helped her back to the house before saddling Ranger and riding out at a pace that made Eleanor's heart pound with worry. But she trusted his skill, trusted that his need to protect her and their child would keep him careful even in his urgency. The hours that followed were simultaneously the longest and shortest of Eleanor's life. She labored alone at first, walking the house as Mrs. Chen's instructions had recommended, breathing through contractions that grew steadily stronger. She thought of her mother, wished Margaret could be here to see her grandchild born, and drew strength from the memory of her mother's courage in facing her own death. Caleb returned with Mrs. Chen in less than 2 hours, having ridden Ranger nearly to exhaustion. The midwife bustled in, took one look at Eleanor, and immediately began issuing orders. She'd brought another woman with her, her daughter Sarah, who'd assisted with dozens of births. Mr. Mercer, I need you to boil water and gather clean linens, Mrs. Chen said briskly. Then you can sit with your wife and help her through the contractions. Sarah and I will handle the rest. The labor intensified as day faded to evening. Eleanor walked, squatted, breathed through pain that seemed to split her in half, and clung to Caleb's hands as each contraction built and crested and finally ebbed. He stayed with her through all of it, his face pale but resolute, murmuring encouragement and support even as she could see the helpless terror in his eyes. You're doing so well, he told her during a brief respite, wiping sweat from her face with a cool cloth. You're the strongest person I've ever known. Tell me that when this is over, Eleanor gasped as another contraction began building. Night fell, and still the baby wouldn't come. Mrs. Chen checked Eleanor's progress with practiced hands, her expression growing concerned. The baby's positioned wrong, she said quietly. Heads turned slightly. We need to shift it. What followed was agony unlike anything Eleanor had experienced. Mrs. Chen's hands worked inside her, manipulating, pressing, trying to turn the baby while Eleanor screamed and Caleb held her shoulders, his own face wet with tears. I can't, Eleanor sobbed. I can't do this anymore. Yes, you can. Caleb's voice was fierce in her ear. You can do anything, Eleanor. You're braver than any soldier I ever fought beside. You can do this. Our baby needs you to do this. Mrs. Chen's face suddenly brightened. There, the heads turned. Now, Eleanor, next contraction, I need you to push with everything you have. Eleanor bore down with strength she didn't know she possessed, feeling her body tear and stretch impossibly, feeling Caleb's hands supporting her, hearing Mrs. Chen's voice coaching her through each push. The pain was transcendent, beyond anything she'd imagined, but beneath it was purpose, the primal drive to bring this new life into the world. "I can see the head," Sarah called out. "One more push, maybe two." Eleanor gathered every last reserve of strength and pushed until spots danced in her vision and her throat was raw from screaming. She felt a sensation of impossible pressure and then sudden release as the baby slid free, and immediately the room filled with a thin, reedy cry. "It's a boy!" Mrs. Chen announced, laughing as she cleaned the infant and cut the cord. "A healthy baby boy, lungs strong as a blacksmith's bellows." She placed the squalling, red-faced baby on Eleanor's chest, and Eleanor stared down at their son through tears of exhaustion and joy and relief. He was perfect, tiny fists waving, dark hair plastered to his small head, eyes squeezed shut as he announced his displeasure at being born into a cold world. Caleb made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and reached out with a trembling hand to touch his son's head. "He's so small," he whispered in awe. "So perfect." "John," Eleanor said softly, looking up at Caleb through her tears. "John Mercer. Welcome to the world, little one." The baby calmed at the sound of her voice, his cries fading to small, mewling sounds as he nuzzled against her. Mrs. Chen worked efficiently to deliver the afterbirth and tend to Eleanor's tears, but Eleanor barely noticed, completely absorbed in studying this miracle they'd created. Caleb couldn't take his eyes off his son. His face transformed with a wonder that made him look young, almost vulnerable. When Mrs. Chen finally finished her work and offered to take the baby so Eleanor could rest, Caleb asked hesitantly, May I hold him?" Mrs. Chen smiled and carefully transferred the swaddled infant to Caleb's arms. He cradled his son with the same careful intensity he brought to everything important, supporting the small head with hands that had dealt death, but now held life with infinite gentleness. "Hello, John," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your father. I don't know much about being a father, but I promise I'll do my best. I'll protect you, teach you, love you more than anything in this world. You and your mother, you're my everything." Eleanor watched through exhausted tears as this hard, dangerous man who'd killed to survive met his son for the first time. And she saw the final transformation complete itself. This was no longer just Caleb Mercer, the rancher, the war veteran, the man with a violent reputation. This was Caleb Mercer, the father, the husband, the man who'd chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes of his past. Mrs. Chen and Sarah stayed 3 days, ensuring Eleanor recovered properly and teaching both new parents the basics of caring for an infant. John proved to be a good baby, nursing well and sleeping in reasonably predictable cycles, though his lungs were formidable when he decided he was hungry or uncomfortable. "He's got your stubbornness," Caleb told Eleanor on the second night, walking a fussy John while Eleanor tried to rest. "Once he decides he wants something, there's no reasoning with him." "And your persistence," Eleanor countered, smiling at the sight of her husband gently bouncing their son. "He won't give up until he gets what he needs." When Mrs. Chen finally left, promising to return in a week to check on them again, Eleanor and Caleb were alone with their son for the first time. The responsibility was overwhelming and exhilarating in equal measure. The weeks that followed were a blur of feeding schedules, diaper changes, and precious moments of watching John sleep or grip their fingers with surprising strength. Caleb proved to be a devoted father, rising instantly when John cried in the night, learning to change diapers with the same methodical precision he applied to everything, singing lullabies in his rough voice that somehow soothed the baby better than anything else. Eleanor watched him transform further with each passing day. The wariness that had defined him began to ease, replaced by a contentment she'd never seen before. He laughed more, smiled more readily, seemed lighter somehow, as though fatherhood had given him permission to lay down the armor he'd worn for so long. Spring arrived in full force, painting the valley in wildflowers and new grass. The cattle thrived, the ranch prospered, and the Mercer family settled into the rhythms of their new life. Neighbors who'd kept their distance before began stopping by, bringing gifts for the baby, offering help with ranch work, welcoming Eleanor and Caleb into the community in ways they'd never experienced before. Thomas Garrett came one afternoon in May, his hat in his hands. his expression genuinely contrite. Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Mercer, I wanted to apologize again for my behavior last year. I've heard about your kindness to folks, about how you've helped several ranchers with their herds, about how you let the law handle the Callahan situation when most men would have just killed him. I misjudged you, sir, both of you. I hope we can start fresh. Caleb, holding John in one arm, extended his free hand. We can do that, Garrett. I'm not the man I was a year ago. Fatherhood changes your perspective. That it does. Garrett shook Caleb's hand firmly, then smiled at the baby. Handsome boy. He's got your eyes, Mercer. Poor child, Eleanor joked, and all three of them laughed. As summer deepened, the ranch became a hub of activity. Caleb hired 2 ranch hands, young men from town who needed work and were willing to learn. Having help meant Caleb could spend more time with Eleanor and John, could be present for the small daily miracles of watching his son grow and change. John was an alert baby, his pale blue eyes, so like his father's, tracking everything with fierce curiosity. He smiled early, laughed often, and showed signs of the stubborn determination both his parents possessed. Caleb would lie on the floor and let John grab his fingers, would carry him through the barn to show him the horses and cattle, would tell him stories about the land they lived on and the life they were building. Someday this will all be yours, Caleb told John one evening as they stood on the porch watching the sunset. But more importantly, you'll know that it was built with love, not just defended with violence. You'll know that your parents chose each other every day, chose to build something good even when the world tried to break us. Eleanor, standing beside them, leaned her head on Caleb's shoulder. He'll know he was wanted, loved, protected, not out of fear, but out of devotion. That's the best legacy we can give him. In August, they received word that Seth Callahan had been found dead in California, killed in a bar fight over cards. With his death, the last shadow of that old conflict faded. Caleb received the news with quiet sadness rather than relief. Another life wasted on anger, he said, holding Eleanor close that night after they'd put John to bed. Seth could have started over, built something new. Instead, he carried his hatred until it destroyed him. I'm grateful every day that you saved me from that fate, Eleanor, that you showed me there was another way. As autumn returned, painting the mountains in gold and crimson, the Mercers celebrated John's first 6 months with a gathering at the ranch. Neighbors came from miles around bringing food and gifts, celebrating not just the baby, but the family that had become a cornerstone of their small community. Sheriff Hendricks pulled Caleb aside during the festivities. You've changed this valley, Mercer. Used to be folks were scared of you, kept their distance. Now you're the one they turn to when there's trouble. Just last week, the Johnsons asked if you'd mediate their property dispute with the Martins. That's the kind of reputation you've got now, not as the dangerous man who'll kill you, but as the fair one who'll help you find peaceful solutions. Caleb glanced across the yard to where Eleanor sat with John, surrounded by women cooing over the baby. I had good motivation to change, and a better teacher than I deserved. That night, after their guests had departed and John was asleep in his cradle, Eleanor and Caleb stood on their porch watching the stars emerge. The air was crisp with the promise of coming winter, and Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter. Do you ever think about that first day I arrived? She asked. How terrified I was. How uncertain. Every day. I think about the courage it took for you to step off that stage knowing what people had told you about me. I think about how you could have run, but chose to stay. I think about how different my life would be if you hadn't taken that chance. Caleb's arm circled her waist, pulling her close. I was so careful to keep everyone at a distance, so convinced that isolation was strength. You proved me wrong about everything. We proved each other wrong. I thought I was just choosing survival. I didn't know I was choosing life, real, full, beautiful life. Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd become her everything. The stage driver told me you were dangerous. He was right, you know. You are dangerous. To despair, to loneliness, to the idea that broken things can't be made whole again. Caleb smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his entire face. You know what I think? I think we were both broken when we found each other. And somehow putting our pieces together made us both stronger than we ever were alone. Inside, John began to fuss, and they both turned toward the sound automatically, that parental instinct already deeply ingrained. But before they went in, Caleb pulled Eleanor back for one more moment. I love you, he said, the words coming easily now, no longer strange or difficult. I love you more today than yesterday, and I'll love you more tomorrow than today. That's the only promise I know how to keep perfectly. Then it's the only promise I need. Eleanor kissed him softly, tasting the future on his lips, feeling the past release its hold with each shared breath. Let's go tend to our son. They walked inside together, partners in every sense, and lifted John from his cradle. He settled immediately in Caleb's arms, his tiny fist gripping his father's finger, his eyes already drifting closed again. Eleanor watched her husband sway gently with their son, humming a lullaby his own mother had sung to him a lifetime ago, and felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. This house that had seemed so cold and stark when she'd first arrived was now filled with warmth and love and laughter. The man who terrified her with his reputation had become the source of her greatest joy and deepest security. She thought of her mother's journal, still kept safe in her drawer, and mentally added her own entry to its pages. I came west afraid, desperate, certain I was choosing the lesser of two evils. Instead, I found everything I'd stopped believing in: safety, love, home, family. I found a man who was exactly as dangerous as they warned me, but only to the things that would hurt us. I found a partner who chose to be better every day for our sake. I found home, not in a place, but in a person. And that has made all the difference. Years would pass, bringing more children, a daughter named Margaret with her mother's green eyes, another son named Thomas, who had Caleb's quiet intensity. The ranch would grow and prosper, becoming known throughout the territory not just for its cattle, but for the family that ran it with fair dealing and honest work. Caleb would serve as deputy sheriff for a time, using his skills to protect the community rather than just his own property. Eleanor would start a school, teaching the valley's children to read and write and cipher. But those were stories for other days. Tonight, they were simply a family, mother, father, son, standing together in a house that had been transformed from shelter to home by the power of choice and commitment and fierce, protective love. Caleb laid John back in his cradle and turned to Eleanor, his eyes reflecting the lamplight and something deeper, something that hadn't been there the day she'd arrived. Hope, Eleanor realized. Joy. The belief that tomorrow would be better than today because they would face it together. Ready for bed? He asked, offering his hand. Eleanor took it, feeling the calluses, the scars, the strength that had defended her, and the gentleness that cherished her in equal measure. Ready for whatever comes, she said, as long as we face it together. They crossed the hall to their bedroom, leaving the door ajar so they could hear if John needed them, and settled into the bed they shared. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of coming winter and distant smoke from neighbors' chimneys. The land was harsh, the life demanding, but they had built something precious here, something worth defending, worth fighting for, worth choosing every single day. Eleanor drifted toward sleep with Caleb's arms around her, their son breathing softly in the next room, and thought about the warning she'd received on that dusty street so many months ago. Caleb Mercer is dangerous. They'd been right. He was dangerous. Dangerous to anyone who threatened what he loved, dangerous in his fierce devotion, dangerous in his absolute refusal to let harm come to his family. But he was also gentle, patient, capable of tremendous love, despite all the violence he'd seen and committed. He was both things, and that was exactly what she needed, what they all needed. In the morning, they would wake to John's demands for breakfast. Caleb would tend the animals while Eleanor fed their son. They would work together to maintain the home they'd built, to protect the life they'd created, to love each other through whatever challenges the day brought. It would be hard sometimes, joyful others, but always shared. That was enough. That was everything. Eleanor's last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was simple and profound. She had come west seeking survival and found love instead. She had married a dangerous man and discovered he was only dangerous to those who would hurt what he cherished. She had chosen fear initially, but fear had led her to courage, and courage had led her home. And home, she now understood, was not a place at all. Home was Caleb's arms around her, John's soft breathing in the next room, the future they were building one choice at a time. Home was the certainty that no matter what came, they would face it together, stronger for their shared struggles, deeper for their mutual trust, unbreakable because they'd chosen love over every other option. That was the truth the warnings had missed, the reality that could only be discovered through living it. Sometimes the most dangerous thing was also the safest, and sometimes the greatest risk led to the greatest reward. Eleanor had taken that risk, and she would make the same choice every day for the rest of her life. Because Caleb Mercer was dangerous, but only to those who would hurt her. To Eleanor and their children, he was simply home, and that made all the difference in the world.